And I want to welcome all of you to the meeting of the Beyond Black History Month program. We have an honored guest, as we have been so fortunate. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Waddell. I will highlight him and spotlight him so he can do an introduction. And I believe Jean is going to be able to pull up a slideshow when Mike is ready. You didn't know you'd be that big on the screen.
Oh, that's really big.
Now everybody can see what you look like.
I can read the numbers off my microwave.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mike Weddle, and our presenter today, our guest, is Carmen Jackson, and Carmen Jackson has been a big influence in my life. In Western Maryland, it's Appalachia, it's rural Appalachia in Western Maryland. Carmen was known as the mother of NAACP. And as a branch president, she recruited me, and I was kind of reluctant to be recruited. Joy had a part in that too. She's on this call. But she did recruit me, and she convinced me to join. And she was a mentor and a friend who started my education with schooling in things like health and equity, back when I was kind of unconvinced that I might have a role in this struggle. Carmen comes from Chicago. She's the daughter of civil rights activists. She marched with her mother and with Dr. King, who was a family friend, and her experiences really carried through her life as she tells it. And I'm not going to tell her story. She's much better at doing that, but really inspired her to become a civil rights activist in her own right. I invited her to speak because of the way that she influenced me and because of the way that her stories inspired me. In Maryland, she was the NAACP president. She was assistant vice president of student education, responsible for our university's diversity center in rural Western Maryland. Her background is in educational counseling. Carmen has chaired a foster care review board for 30 years, where the foster children are mainly the children of color. And she also was a candidate for our school board. So I'm going to ask a question to get this started, then I'm going to sort of take myself off the stage because, Carmen, I'm sure has a lot to say, and I don't want to take up any more of her time. But to start things off, Carmen, I know that you grew up with some giants in the fight for civil rights and the fight for African American rights. And I'm hoping that you can share with us some of that experience and how it influenced you. Carmen, thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you. The title of my talk today is Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around. And in preparation, I was looking for a song to play, like a YouTube song or so forth. But what I discovered to my dislike was that all the marching songs has been upgraded to today's qualities with band and music, and that's not what it was like in freedom, when we were fighting for freedom. When we were fighting for freedom, those songs were angry, loud, forceful, because we didn't have a seat at the table. So our seat was in the marches, and nobody could tell us what to say, what to do, and we were just defiant, especially in our language. So I'm going to present a little bit of that song to you, but envision me yelling and screaming like I'm mad at you when I sing it. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking and keep on talking and marching up the freedom land. Ain't gonna let Jim Crow turn me around, turn me around, Turn me around, ain't gonna let Jim Crow turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking and keep on talking and marching up the freedom land. So our songs were sang with a broken dialect on purpose. I always say to people that English is my second language. I always have to get help with English because my mother's from Arkansas, and I just grew up in a community with a dialect that was broken.
What? Share the video.
Hmm. So anyway, we came up with a dialect that was broken. I don't know what's going on with the screen, but I guess it'll catch up. So this is a picture of my mother and myself. This is when my mother moved to Frostburg and lived here for four years with my mother and my sister. And my mother is very important to this entire story because while I'm going to take a few minutes to tell her story, I have to do that because my story exists because of her story. My mother, we came up in Cabrini Green projects. And my mother, being the mother of 5 children, a single parent, and she was a fighter. She always said, run for something politically, no matter what that is. And that's exactly what she did. Next slide, please. We moved to the Cabrini Green projects. And so my basic raising was in the projects in Cabrini Green homes. And in those homes, we really had a peaceful life for numerous years there. But things got out of hand, things went south. We had the gangs that started moving in, the Bloods and the Crips. And at first, and I could have it reversed, but I think the Crips came first, and then the Bloods came in to take over from the Crips. And the young men in the project were forced. You either had to get in one of the gangs or you were not protected. And so it was a miserable life. But my family was able to, because of my mother, survive all of that crime and so forth. My mother had the support of my father. That one thing they never argued about was the kids. Whatever she said, he supported. So he was not absent. He was still daddy. So we moved into Cabrini Green projects where everything was, I don't know, in an upheaval. Our educational system was not well, and we'll talk a little more about education later. But if we can go to the next slide. My mother, and I was the youngest of the 5 children, ran for state representative in the 11th district in Chicago. The district is a different number now, but I don't know what that is. I just remember during her election, we always sang that pull lever 15B for Clorie Lee. And we'd all over the neighborhood yelling, pull lever 15B for Clorie Lee. And we passed out leaflets and knocked on doors. I mean, and I was just raised to do that. As you know, and I'll tell you now, I'm 72 years old. And why am I telling you that? Because when I listen to presentations like that, I spend the time trying to figure out how old was she then and how old was she? So I was 72 years, I'm 72 years old now. And so you don't have to, work out the numbers to figure it out. And I'm proud of it. I'm proud of it because unfortunately for years now, there's only been 3 living people, all female, from my school, from my class in high school. Only 3 of us still live. And the rest are gone because of crime, drugs, gangs, just all kind of violent situations. I could go on and on about that. Specific situations. My nightmare was the person that was going to take me to my prom was killed the week before. And they had put drugs in his veins and tied him up in a chair and all this. So those are the kinds of situations that we grew up with. Every Monday, it was like, who didn't make it? It was like we lived in a war zone. I remember one day my mother and brother were in the kitchen talking, and my brother left the kitchen, walked out the front door, and there were gunshots. And my mother flew out of the house. And fortunately, my mother and brother were not shot, but they flew out of the house right between gunshots between a cop and someone else. And so easily, either or both of them could have been killed that day. So that's the kind of lifestyle and stress that I came up in. I still have trouble sleeping at night because night was the only time I could function and study and think because there was so much chaos in the daytime. You want to go to the next screen? This is my freedom hat. And I just want to talk a little bit about the marches. Dr. King trained us in the art of marching. And my mother, with the wisdom that she had, she never sent us kids out of the room. Every meeting, we were there. I was there, sitting on the steps with a few other kids. And we were allowed to listen, but not interrupt. But after every meeting, Dr. King would come over and talk to just the kids. He would give us undivided attention before he talked to any adults. And in those meetings, he talked about the purpose in marching, what things you need to do before you even decide to march. You were not allowed to march unless you had a definition of what you were marching for, what you wanted to achieve. And then you didn't stop marching until you achieved that goal. So there was a lot of meetings and preparation going up before every march where there was discussions about what the community wanted. And then we agreed on it, and that's what we marched for. And that's what we demanded. So Dr. King was in our living room where a lot of the meetings were held on a regular basis. And my mother running for office, I can't say he endorsed her because he was not allowed to endorse anyone because of his funding, but he was there for support of her speeches, training. He really kept our community moving. And we had precinct captains that were trained to do certain roles. And the purpose in this hat, when we went on a march, back then we didn't have cell phones or any of the things we have now. Only the precinct captains or the leaders had little microphones to talk to each other. And the reason I had a freedom hat was because each group from each area had something that they were wearing that would identify what group they belonged to. And back then there was a lot of paddy wagons where they would load us into paddy wagons to get us out of the march. Mostly the men. I was never put in the paddy wagon. But the system was, if you saw someone in a certain color shirt, then they would get on the microphone and say to each other, so-and-so just got picked up, somebody with one of your shirts on got picked up at a certain location. Our group had the hats, and across the front it says freedom. When I put on that hat, I felt powerful. I felt like I'm fighting for freedom and you're not going to turn me around. And one thing that happened at one of the marches, when, you know, I'm pretty young, 7, 8, 9 years old. I didn't understand one of the songs we were singing. And two people that I knew, their name was in the song. And I'm like, what is this about? And that's when I learned that in the songs and the things we were singing, we were communicating. And the song was, Wayne and Sybil climbed the power pole, fighting for the freedom, so I am told. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, you got to hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, you got to hold on. So my first question was, when I got home, and I would ask my sister, her name is Linda, she might be hearing us, I don't know. But why was Wayne and Sybil's name in the song? We never sang it like that before. Where'd that come from? And so she explained, and I saw this with my own eyes, but I didn't know what I was seeing. She said they had climbed this street pole light, and they would look down the street to tell us which way not to go, which way was fortified with cops. So that's how they communicated and controlled the crowd as to which way we would go next. So they were up on the freedom pole and telling us and directing us which way to go. And the song said, you know, watch Wayne and Sybil. They're on the freedom pole, fighting for the freedom. And so from that day forward, I started listening to the meaning of every song and how it was applied and what did it mean. And, you know, I just was obsessed with the interpretation of songs. So that's some of the things that went on with the marches. Again, we can go on and on about that, but let's go to the next slide. This is a friend of mine, Danny Underwood, more a friend of my sister, because they were the same age and they were real friends. I was just the little kid in the room getting on everybody's nerve. But Danny was a Black Panther member, and I thought he was one of the founders, but he was not. He explained to me just recently he had gone to Mississippi, had done a lot of the marches in Mississippi, and that's where he became a Black Panther and start carrying guns in their freedom fights. So it's a very enriched story, but the reason he impacted me was because when he came back, I already knew him as a family friend, and he was a Black Panther. That was my first introduction to Black Panthers. And in the news, it had become very popular that they claimed that Black Panthers were a menace to society. They were dangerous. They were armed Black men. But I never experienced what they were saying in the news. What I experienced was feeling safe when they were around. They policed the neighborhood against being attacked from whites, but also to make sure crime stayed down in the city and in the communities. So their presence made me feel secure. And they had all kind of programs for the kids. They mentored us. We would Saturday morning go for breakfast, and we get to see other kids that we normally wouldn't be around during school because they came from different communities. And it was just, they created a wonderful environment. And I'm just sad that they were painted out to be bad, because they were the best thing that happened in our community. There's a lot I could say about the Black Panthers and things that I've learned, but we'll move to the next slide, please. Here's my mommy. My mother organized the Freedom Train to go to Chicago, from Chicago to the March on Washington. Boy, was that train fun. The train, I don't know how many cars was in that train, but to me, it was real long, but I was young, so I don't know, how long it was. But we went from train to train. It was one big party. The train did not stop any place except Ohio to change the drivers and so forth, the crew. And so we were free to just run the train because no one could steal us off the train. Nothing could happen to us. And at every spot on that train was something going on that was fun. It was someone singing, or someone playing cards, or someone gambling, or someone drinking alcohol. It was just one big party, or playing a boombox. And us kids, I had never had that much freedom to roam anywhere, because we were kept at our front door. We had to have sights on me at all times because I was the youngest. And the Freedom Train was so impressive. It was impressive because no matter where you stopped, you could just eat what other people had. You didn't have to ask. You want a piece of chicken? Here, have a piece of chicken. You want greens? Here's greens. Everybody had plenty of food, and we just shared it. And we didn't have to be watched as we were used to being watched. So now I look back at that and realize that my mother pulled off a big activity. She really did, because we sold to have that Freedom Train. Just imagine everybody on that train just about was too poor to pay for a ticket in full by themselves. We had all kind of chicken dinners we sold, all kind of raffles. I don't know how many activities they had to come up with the money, but no one who wanted to go was turned away. The money was collected, money was donated, and we all got on that Freedom Train. And I asked my sister, because I couldn't remember, where did we sleep that night when we were in DC? And she said, we didn't stay in DC. We got back on the train. Yeah, right back on the train to come back. But I always thought that the March on Washington was on August 29th. And the reason for that is because August 29th is my birthday. It just so happened that on August 28th, that was the march, but that was the day they gave me my birthday cake. So I spent most of my life thinking that the march was on my birthday and in honor of me. But that's okay. We had fun with that. And during the march, one thing happened. My mother worked for a company back then called Field Made, and she designed undergarments for that company. And any undergarment that she created, she made in the sizes of one of her girls. So there was 3 girls in the family. And so I had on a pretty slip, thank goodness, because I had on a wraparound skirt, and I'm just marching up the freedom land. And my skirt fell off. So that was the biggest uproar for the whole event. Was I was marching up the freedom land. My skirt was still in the back somewhere. Somebody hollering, "You lost your skirt, you lost your skirt." And but like I said, because my mother had designed me a beautiful, beautiful slip, I was okay. And I was a little girl. So, but that was the fun thing I remember about that. Now, I stuck this picture on The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. And as I said earlier, and my mother, she passed away at 98 years old. And all the books that she had in her life, that was the only book in her bedroom. And us kids all read it. And then I was talking to Mike, and he said, well, he was one of the founders of SALA. And I'm like, oh, I didn't pick that up. SALA. So it made me go back, get the book, read it. And so I will be going to Washington, D.C. soon. And when we get to see our family picture, you'll see a whole group of people that have all read that book. So we can go to our next page. And in 1964, my mother ran for Congress. She was nominated and ran for Congress. And so when I said to people, she was the first African-American woman in the United States that ran for Congress. That was in 1964. She did not win, but I share with you, that was a very dark day, the election day. We had fun campaigning and doing what campaigns do. And election day, my mother had already told us there could be problems. And we had to be with her as she went from polling place to polling place. Well, I say we, mostly me, because I was the youngest. So when she got to one polling place, she was challenging the fact that they had stuffed the ballot machine. And any vote for her was not a vote for her. And it went to her opponent. And literally, they put my mother in jail that day. And the workers had instructions to take all 5 of her children, make sure we were home together, and to stay in the house. And that's what we did. They escorted me home, and she went to jail. I was crying and all upset. While we were home, and she had instructed us to lay on the floor. That's not uncommon in the ghetto. You lay on the floor because if you're just sitting watching TV, if gunshots ring out, you don't want to be sitting in the way. So you lay on the floor a lot. So we were laying on the floor, and a couple cars came past throwing bricks through the window and yelling and screaming at us and terrorizing us while my mother was in jail. The good thing is they let her out after the polls closed. So we weren't home alone all night. But those are the kind of terror tactics that was used on us as a family. And I'll never forget it. So fighting for voting rights is one of my missions that I've never shied away from. So we can go to our next slide. Very good. This was a slide of my mother, the woman there with the hat. And John Bone is standing far back in the picture. He was one of the freedom fighters. And then to my mother's right is Dr. King, and he was the guest speaker that day. And my mother introduced him. But there's a little kid on that podium. His name is Eddie. That little kid is my nephew, who is now 40 something, if not closer to 50. But what I love about sharing that story is my mother always had the kids involved. We did not have to get off the stage. We did not have to leave the room. We were always involved. He was probably up there to make sure he wasn't lost in the crowd. I'm 10 years older than Eddie, so I guess I was big enough at that point to not have to be next to her on the stage. So Eddie is my nephew that was on the stage. So in any way, Dr. King spoke that day. And the building behind it in that picture, I think it's torn down now, so I can't verify it, but I believe that was the church where I was baptized as a child. I believe that's what that building was. I don't know how to verify that, but that's what I believe. And so Dr. King came out in support of my mother's campaigns every chance he had. I mean, most of the campaign was built around him because, see, back then he wasn't as nationally known as he was eventually. So him coming to the community and training us and being with us was just really no big deal. I guess we've known then what we know now. I would have, paid better attention or took more pictures or whatever. But anyway, we can go to our next slide. This is the family of greatness. The top center is my Daddy Samuel Bryant. And my sister, Constance Jeanette Bryant Holston, was the oldest of the 5 children, and she is now deceased. And then under her is my brother, David Jerome Bryant, who is also now deceased. And my brother in the top left-hand corner, his name is Sam. He died from COVID. And that's still a devastation that it's hard for me to believe. And that little bitty baby in the front center is my daughter, Chloe. So anyone that knows her knows she's a big girl now. And my son, Lancey, is right up over my mother's shoulder. So I know you may not be able to follow everything in the picture, but I said that to say this. The one thing my mother always understood, if you didn't have an education, you weren't going far in life. And she made sure that every one of her children had the opportunity to go to school. Every one of us was always literate, advanced in our classes. There was just no room for not being educated. I was the youngest of 5. I was the first one to go away to college. My sister went to college first, but she stayed home and went to college. I was the first one to go away and live residentially in college. And so that was just a big achievement for our family, because after I did that, my brother went back, my sister completed her master's, and the whole family is educated. But one thing I can say, we all read Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Black Man. She just felt we had to know what we were up against. And she had to make sure we knew not to fall into that trap. So we can go to our next slide. The Cabrini Green Housing Project. Cabrini, as I said earlier, was a lot of crime and so forth. But I always fought to go to a different school from where I lived. And one of the schools I went to as a junior high was the Cooley High School, as a junior high member of that school. And in the school, they were not trained to go to college. There was no college prep whatsoever. And you could get passed along and passed out of from one grade to another. You could almost graduate with no education and almost be illiterate. And back then. So that was not good enough for my mother. So I fought to go to a different high school, Waller Waller High School. And I had to take the bus to school every day. My sister went to a school on the south side near where my father lived. But she just would not settle for us to get that kind of an miseducation. And so we all were, I fought all my life to go to a better school. And I always wondered why my story wasn't as important as Ruby Bridges' story. But I grew up to realize she had a different story because they had to have armed guards take her into school. Well, I didn't have that. When I first tried to integrate a grade school, which was a few blocks from the house, but it was in an all-white neighborhood. Now, Cabrini Green Projects, as much as we talk about the gangs, the fights, and so forth, it was right above, up against the Gold Coast. So we could walk to the Gold Coast and we would go to the Oak Street Beach, which was the lakefront, which was the whoop-de-doo of Chicago. So we were surrounded by very well provided for schools and very well educated situations. So I fought to go to this grade school. And the morning we went, the first time we were going to go, it was supposed to be, I think, about a dozen of us. And the night before, I was told only 3 said they were going to show up. And I said, well, I'm going anyway. So that morning, it turned out I was the only one to show up to integrate this grade school. I went for about a week. And my mother withdrew me from the school. She was made to understand that it was too dangerous for me to be in that school. And so, of course, I was brought back to Jenner School. So that was my big effort to integrate a school. So we didn't have the cops come in and so forth. That actually administrations were trying to integrate the school, but they felt that it was too much and that I would be harmed. But I didn't care. I was marching up the Freedom Lane. I was a little naive. I didn't feel like I was in danger, but the adults decided I was. And then in the Cabrini Green Projects in 1981, Mayor Jane Burns, she moved into projects. She was the mayor of Chicago at the time, and she was going to fix them projects. Boy, she was going to make everything go right. Well, before she even moved in, they cleaned up the whole building. They painted stuff. They really, laid out the red carpet for her. So we realized then that they knew what they were supposed to do for us. They weren't going to do it. She moved in, and literally 2 weeks later, she moved out. I applaud her for her efforts, but it brought up for me a very dark time because when she was there, a family friend who we called our brother, Ralph Moey, M-O-E-Y, was killed by some gang members out in back of a 7-Eleven store, under the train tracks by the 7-Eleven store. And he was murdered. And that was my first real experience with that kind of a death of someone that I cared so much about. He was like a brother because he didn't have a mother or a father. He ate most meals with us. He hung out with my brothers like he was one of my brothers. And he was killed. And I was so upset because Jane Burns said she was going to come clean this mess up, and she let them kill my brother. I was a little naive, I would say. But as an adult, I applaud her efforts. But she was out of there in 2 weeks. And she was there with armed guards, and she couldn't handle 2 weeks. So that gives you an idea of how bad things were in Cabrini Green Projects. So the next slide, please. This is my East Coast family. We're missing a slide. Oh, no, we're not. No, we're not. We did it. This is my East Coast family that I've acquired since I've been on the East Coast. I came here 46 years ago to work at Frostburg State University and stayed. And so my niece came here, lived with me, and married a young man from Frostburg State, and they live in Baltimore. My son has two sons, and so they're in the pictures. And I know you can't follow along exactly everything. And then my daughter recently has two children, Chloe and Mo, and my son's name is Lance Jr. My husband Lance Sr. became a deacon in the church, and at the bottom is me and my son Lance the day he went to Florida. And so anyway, and the group picture at the top is my husband's siblings, which are part of now my family. So this is our East Coast family, and so this family down at the bottom right is my nephew Alan Harper. And his sister Deanne, my niece, who were actually adopted, not officially adopted, but their parents' mother died, and I kept up with them as if they were mine. So I include them as part of my family. So that's Alan and Deanne Harper at the bottom right. So at any rate, out of all of what went on in Chicago, I moved to the East Coast and acquired a whole new family. And we go back and forth with each other and love each other and know each other well. I wish I could tell you about what everybody's done and been doing, but it would be eye-opening. I'm fortunate enough to say that none of my relatives were a part of being harmed during our stay in Cabrini Green. When we came out of Cabrini Green, we fled because, as I said earlier, the gangs were taking over, and we just had to get out of there. So I'll wrap it up. There's so many stories I wish I could tell, but we want to keep it reasonable.
And Carmen, I've added Mike back in a spotlight because I think he has a few questions that he hopes you will talk a little bit about. So Mike, would you go ahead and give some questions to Carmen?
Yeah, there is time for a few more stories. And if anyone else has questions, you can put them in the chat. I'll start since I don't see any in the chat. What we do, we record for an hour, but if people want to stay over and ask questions, we don't stop the Zoom after an hour. So there is time afterwards. That really is, I mean, your family, it's a story of bravery and vision combined. And it is, for me, it's very inspiring. I have a vision of the March on Washington and Mahalia Jackson singing Happy Birthday to You. I don't know if that ever happened, but that's the thought that I've had in my head. Carmen, my question, we had a conversation and you know, it's been years, so I don't know if I'm remembering this right. You had mentioned that if y'all had known that Dr. King would be so famous, maybe you would have listened a little better. My impression has always been that you listened just fine. And I remember you telling me once, and boy, I hope I didn't remember this wrong, but when our NAACP president passed away in Cumberland, in Western Maryland, I wasn't a member then. I knew Mr. Winder because I knew him through the hospital, you know. But when he passed away, I remember you telling me that they came to you and asked if you would pick up the mantle and be the leader, the president. And I remember you saying that you prayed to your mother that she would give you a word, that she would speak to you. And I remember you telling me, I think that at that point, the voice that came back was the voice of Dr. King. So I was just hoping you could talk about that a little bit, if I'm getting that story right, what that was like and what that voice said.
Oh, okay. So what happened was, I had no plans of running for president of NAACP. My friend who was the president, Bernard Winder, passed away suddenly. unexpectedly. He had always told me, "You're going to be the next president." I said, "No, when you leave, I'm leaving. I'm here to support you." And I had no interest in being the president. I was just supporting him. And then he goes and dies. So I inherited his position. And I could always hear him say, "You're going to be the next president." I'm like, "Oh, you got me this time." And I came home that night after I became the president, and I said to myself, now what I'm going to do with this? What am I going to do with it? What do I do? I had no plans to be a president. I had no goals of what we were supposed to. I had no plans, but it was in my lap. And then that was the first time ever in my life that I heard Dr. King speak to me. And he said to me, "You know what to do. Let's get to it." And he said it in his voice in my head. That was the first time I decided and claim and share with people that I have been trained by Dr. King. And that was the first time I realized that, because my every step, everything I did as the president in terms of leadership, I consulted with Dr. King and my mother. All my life, I had my mother's information in my head, her guidance, her love, and her affection. But here now I had Dr. King. And so to this day, when I get involved in something or I do something, people wonder, why is she asking so many questions? Why does she need to know this and that? I've been trained. And I've been trained by Dr. King, because that's the voice I now hear, who tells me what certain steps to take and not take, what issues to confront, how to confront, how to lead, how to be in a meeting without blowing up. I could only blow up in my little hat on the picket line. So yeah, I'm trained by Dr. King, and I own that. I'm not, first I said, well, I'm not going to tell people that because they're going to think that I'm making things up, or they're going to think I was too young to remember. No, not only do I remember like he was here yesterday. His family was in my house. We have pictures of that. I had Yolanda King here as a guest speaker, and she was flabbergasted by the pictures I had of her when she was a little kid in my mother's living room. Yeah, I can claim I was trained by Dr. King. And that was because of the grace of my mother. We were always, as children, in the room. We were never sent out. And that's because Dr. King, in his infinite wisdom, was always training us kids. As I said, when he would stop talking, he would come and gather the kids and answer our questions first. And no adult in that room was more important than the kids to him.
Carmen, we do have a participant, Fran Taylor, who'd like to ask a question. So
Sure.
Fran, you unmute yourself.
I
You
did.
can go ahead and talk.
Thank you, Carmen. I heard you say that with the Cabrini Green being so close to the Gold Coast, that there did come a time, I lived in Indiana, Northwest Indiana for a while, and there did come a time that under the guise of cleaning things up and providing affordable housing, there was a movement to tear down Cabrini Green and to, instead of building something better there, they moved people out because it was right up against Lake Michigan and they wanted to reclaim that land. Were you and the NAACP involved at that time, or where were you in regard to that occurrence?
At that point, my mother and our family had fled the community. ironically, our apartment is still there. And we believe that that's our apartment in the first picture in the row houses.
Yeah.
All the other buildings, the schools are all torn down, and the community fought against them taking the land, but of course they eventually took it, and it's now all like an extension of the Gold Coast. And most visits home I drive through, but the low rise. And what was important about the low rise where we lived on a corner unit, 483 North Oak Street. And right next to our house was the playground. And we had a lot of famous people that came out of the Cabrini Green Project. One person was Major Lance, who sang the song was Monkey Time. But anyway, and our house being right next to it, we housed like the basketball was in our house. The guys would come in, go to the closet, take the basketball out, take it to the court. They didn't have to knock on the door. It was just one big family most of the time before the crime really settled in. And so yeah, our unit is still there as far as I know. So I'll have to go back through again. But it's all fenced in like animals live there. And that's the way the high rises were. The one picture I showed, the high rise, it looked like it's a nice building, but if it had been a close-up view, I got that off the internet, you would see that they had put up chain link fences all the way up to the top. And that's because different items came over the fences and fell to the ground, could possibly hurt people. So they did it for a reason, but literally it looked like an animal house.
Thank you, Fran. We're going to go back to Mike again. I think you have some other questions you would love Carmen to talk about.
I think Bob has a question.
Okay, Bob, would you
Yeah, I
unmute?
was just gonna ask if you and your mother went on the march, the 1965 march to New York.
No,
That was when Dr. King came out against the war.
no.
You didn't go, okay.
I was wondering about the difference between your training ground, which was, Chicago, and where you ended up assuming leadership was really rural Appalachia. I mean, Cumberland really is Appalachia. I remember, kids would carry Confederate flags to school. And one thing I remember about you is that you and the sheriff sort of had each other on speed dial, and as soon as something happened, you'd be on the phone with each other. That really impressed me. I'm assuming in Chicago that didn't happen, but could you talk about the difference between Chicago and working in a rural place like that?
Well, the closeness, to explain our closeness with the sheriff, is because his mother had worked for me at Frostburg State University. I had a night watch program, and I hired elderly individuals to sit up at the residence halls to admit students after dark. And they stayed overnight. And his mother was one of those people. And she always appreciated the fact that I hired elderly in the community because they couldn't get jobs anywhere else. And so these elderly workers became like mothers to the kids in the buildings. They knew them by name and sat and talked to them and had good friendships. So coming along, she was always talking about her son, the sheriff. And I didn't know until I ran for office that that was her son. But I had heard every story about him coming up. So that's why one reason we were so close. She probably told him, you better be nice to that woman. Yeah, so that's why we were so close, and we were on speed dial. But that's the success of leadership. You've got to engage your enemy, and I don't consider him an enemy. I'm using it as a metaphor. You don't shut people off because you don't like them or you don't know them or you don't agree with them. No, you embrace them and you seek to understand them as you ask for them to understand you. So I have very good working relationships with just about all the officers or clerks or anybody in a real position in the community will know me by first name. So coming to Appalachia, when I first came, all I did was work. And I worked helping the students, the very few Black students that were allowed in Frostburg State University when I got here. There were so few, I could name every one of them by name. But I also, because of Dr. King and my mother and my upbringing, I knew how to help them through problems without blowing them up, without making it worse. I taught students on a daily basis how to confront a problem without making it worse, because that's what I was taught to do. Dr. King was nonviolent. You know, there was a time in the movement when I was like, I want to be like Malcolm X. I don't want nobody to hit me. Somebody hit me, I'm gonna hit them back. But my mother got control of those thoughts, and we went to follow King. But so because I had already learned all of those leadership skills and styles and purpose and goals and how to achieve things, I had learned all that as a kid. And I imparted it onto individual students. So then my first real fight with race, with leadership in Appalachia was when I started getting involved with NAACP. And I was able under Bernard, who allowed me to help educate him about how to approach things. Because see, when I came to Frostburg State, he was a student. He and his wife, Robin Winder, they were students, and I came as an administrator. So I was able to impart through him, and that's why I was insisting that I would follow him. I wanted to educate him, and so he was much younger than me, and I felt good about that. I always felt my leadership was to be passed on, not to just have, and he allowed me to pass it on through him. So it's just a gift that I got from where I came. So when I got to Appalachia, as bad as things were, I didn't have to freak out about it. I just knew how to grab the mantle and ask people to help me, and people like you came on board. People who weren't even thinking about freedom, I could engage to help. What I find my secret sauce is, you don't ask people to do a lot. You ask people to do one little thing for you. And if you got 10 people doing one little thing, the job is accomplished. You don't demand, you just let everybody help in their way, not your way, and it works. So that's, as far as having different races in the movement, ever since I came up, there were whites that worked in the movement, always. I now believe that it may have been a lot of Jews, but I was too young to distinguish, didn't know any better anyway. So, but my mother used to work on the Gold Coast cleaning houses. And I asked her once, how did you afford to run for an office with 5 children? We sometimes didn't have food to eat. I remember my shoes would have cardboard in the bottom. So how did we afford this campaign that you got into? And she said, because the women she worked for on the Gold Coast, cleaning their houses, she said they were all Jews, and they all funded her campaign. And so I'm thinking, boy, that was a lot of money. And she said, no, back then it was making copies of leaflets and passing them out, not like it is today. And so a lot of her leaflets were printed in their homes or through their husbands' jobs. And that's how she was able to run. I remember I was the expert in running the mimeograph machine. And I asked, why was that always my job? And she said, because I had the rhythm to stay with it, and you couldn't run it real fast because it would bleed, it would jam up, all kinds of, you had to have the rhythm and to make it work. And so that was my biggest job, was running the mimeograph machine that the women gave to my mother. And so that's the difference.
Carmen, it is 5 o'clock.
Okay.
And if you have one last thing you would want this group to know, would you share it with us before I stop the recording?
Yes. Always help in any kind of situation that you're interested in, not what I'm interested in. It could be gun control. It could be education. It could be voting rights. Whatever you choose to work on, just keep doing a little bit at all times. Don't give up. We need everybody's hands on deck. For me, it's voting rights.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I am going to stop the recording.